Effective Business Mastery for Startups, Scaleups, and Early Stage Businesses with your host, Jerry Gadori. And for some of you, a familiar face in our guest, Chris Selland. Chris joined us live a few months back at Startup Business Week, which was amazing. But we wanted to do something of a redo because that was a big open space and we get to have a great conversation. So for those of you new, Chris Selland is a local New England executive with an enormous amount of experience, works nationally as an interim CEO to organizations, and talk about a resource. We want to pick his brain today so that our community get the advantage of some amazing experience. Chris, that was a little abrupt for the vast amount that you've done. Could you share a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Jerry. No, great to be here. Great to see you again. If I recall, at Startup Boston Week, we also weren't on camera. We
Correct.
were only on audio. So I guess people who were in the room may have seen me then, and people have certainly seen me around town. But yeah, so it's good to actually be on video with you live and in a more intimate setting. But I am. A little bit of my background. I am a 3-time former CEO, and currently I am a partner at a firm called TechCXO that provides fractional and interim executives. I'm part of the executive operations practice, which essentially means general management for fractional interim roles, including CEO, COO. One of my clients, and actually the client I spend most of my time with, I'm the sort of interim president of the company, and it's actually long-term interim engagement. So I kind of work with a number of companies. I'm also doing some advisory work for a number of startups. I recently started teaching as a side thing at Northeastern on entrepreneurship and innovation as well. And it's interesting, through that, I'm already picking up a few new kind of advising / mentoring engagements as well. Wow. So I've got a bunch of early stage companies that I'm working with, kind of some more formally, some less formally. So it's fun. I'm kind of at that phase in my career. I like having a portfolio of clients, rather than kind of being all in on one. Although I'm mostly in on one, but I get to do some other stuff as well, and it's great. And it's a lot of fun. Really trying to both deliver value, obviously, to the companies I'm working with, their investors, shareholders, and their teams, and also, just kind of give back to the community a bit as well. The Boston entrepreneurial startup community is a great one. So, although as you can probably see from my backdrop, I'm originally a New Yorker, but I'm kind of transplanted. I've been in Boston now for 30-something years.
We forgive you your sins.
Yeah, no, I'm a Met fan, and we're in the middle of the big series here, so it's been a fun year. So people sometimes comment on that. They're like, "That doesn't look like Boston." I'm like, "No, that's the Flatiron Building." Sort of remind myself where my roots are.
Yeah, and for anyone not familiar, Boston and New York City do not have a lot of love for each other. We're rival cities in a big way.
Yeah, although the funny thing is that the teams that I adopted tend to be the ones that are a little more friendly. Like I said, I'm a Met fan, not a Yankee fan. So I kind of, for the most part, if you put aside 1986, I kind of get a pass on that. So
no, that's awesome. So let me switch gears a little bit. So I've worked in the consulting space for the last decade, and I'd be surprised if your experience in this area was different than mine. But in that time, I've worked with probably 100 or more companies in various capacities, internal and fractional, a lot of leadership consulting, a lot of sales and recruiter training. And I apologize in advance if this sounds selfish. As much as I believe I gave, I learned and grew more in that decade than the two preceding. The opportunity to work closely with such a diverse group of businesses and see what really works and what the tiny percentage of things that are done differently and what they yield has been amazing for me. What has your experience been, Chris?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a combination of being able to work with multiple companies, but also just having a lot of experience. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I think a day some variant of, I wish I knew in my 30s what I know, or even in my 20s, what I know now, right? When I was kind of trying to be an entrepreneur, just because you've seen patterns, and you've seen people, I would say, as much as anything too, because, I was trained as an engineer undergraduate, and, you always tend to think from very mechanically, but you also realize that so much of what happens with companies and why they succeed and fail is much more organic, and it has a lot more to do with the people and the culture. And when you've seen the movie many times over, and different personality types and different cultural attributes. Actually, my Northeastern class yesterday, we were talking and we did an exercise on cultural attributes, and what was constraining and what was enabling, and had the students kind of do some role playing stuff that was, even though it was a short exercise, it was pretty cool. So you start to realize the people and the culture stuff is the most important thing. When you've kind of, walked the path and seen the movie so many times, it's really helpful, I think,
Yeah,
to being able to, kind of help other entrepreneurs figure it out. So.
absolutely. And it's funny, mindset, belief, culture, these things have become somewhat cliched to a lot of folks, but there's a reason why they come up every single time. And it's because they're critical. They're the foundation everything else is built on. And I'll tell you, I mentioned that there's a tiny fractional difference in the companies that really thrive that I personally worked with. And the answer, at least a part of the answer, is always culture. As someone who typically takes the top seat when you're in an interim role, what is the impact of culture been in what you've seen, and how do you impact it yourself?
Yeah, I guess, having been hired in and now brought in, as kind of a fractional, or even when I sort of came in, only one of the three companies I led as CEO did I really found. The other two I was brought in later,
Mm-hmm.
by the investors in both cases. And I think the first thing is, you have to recognize when you walk into a company, culture kind of is what it is
Yes.
to start. At least you can evolve it and adapt it, but it takes time, and it takes leadership, and leadership plays a massive role
Yes.
in that. But you also have to, I believe, at least you have to kind of go in and be willing to, first of all, understand what it is. And I tend to think all cultures have strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes the balance is more strength than weakness, and sometimes it's the other way around. But I think a key to it is kind of finding the strengths, and also finding the pillars of the kind of organization who are sort of carrying that, the strength of the business, if you will. Um, there was actually a post on LinkedIn just this week. Brian Halligan, who is the former CEO and one of the co-founders of HubSpot, was kind of reflecting on his kind of many years at HubSpot. Obviously, they've been, extremely successful company. I would argue, at least in the current day, the most successful startup that's emerged, at least out of the Boston market, and certainly
Very
one of the
familiar
most
with them.
successful startups in the world. Yeah, HubSpot's done great. And Brian sort of talked about the unofficial org chart, and kind of when he looked at, the official org chart, he was talking about trying to get rid of org charts and how you're never going to get rid of that, but that you really have to also understand what there's kind of the one that HR creates that is the official version, but then there's the unofficial version of who actually has influence, and who are, like I said, I sometimes use the analogy of pillars holding up the building. And many cases, not because of the work they're doing, it's because of how much their voice matters to the company, and how much of the cultural kind of being of the company they impart. And so when you walk in, back to your earlier question, it's kind of understanding that and figuring out how to build around that. I tend to think, some may argue that the worst thing you can do is just immediately say, I'm going to go bring in all my own people, and, sorry, goodbye. I think, use another sports analogy. Deion Sanders kind of tried to do that at Colorado, and may work out over the long term. I don't know. Made a lot of noise, but I don't think it worked out too well for them. The football analogy, obviously, for those who don't know. But I remember he was talking about, he walked in, he was like, yeah, all you guys are here. I'm bringing in my own guys. And I don't necessarily, obviously it was football, so it was all guys. But I don't think that really works in companies. I think you got to kind of go in, assess, clearly have an eye to, if you're brought in, particularly if you're brought in by the investors as the new CEO, there's issues, right? So you're going to have to make some changes. But there's also going to be some goodness, and find it first, and then start to try to build around that if possible, rather than going in with I'm going to blow it up and start over.
Yeah,
So,
Chris, if I could pause for a second, you said a lot that I want to unpack. I don't want to glaze over. So a few things that I really want to focus on. One of the things you mentioned, and if you'll tolerate a short war story from earlier in my career, many years ago, when I was first starting out in sales, I did sales of technology professional services, specifically staffing services. And I'm a local Massachusetts guy. I'll leave the name of the company out so I'm not hurting anybody. But I was approaching a local big shoe company in the Boston market. And you can think about it. You just can't say its name, Chris. I was early going to meet the director of IT. I'm a chronically early person by nature. I have an almost phobic level fear of being late. I blame my time in the Marines for that. So I was kind of crazy early, and I knew it. So when I checked in with the receptionist, this is pre-COVID, back when humans did this job, I said, please don't ring my person. I'm very early. I don't want to be rude. I'll just hang out in the lobby. I'll come up again 10 minutes early if you wouldn't mind to ring then. Super sweet lady. And she's like, oh, no problem. I understand. She laughed. I went and sat down. And I was kind of walking around the lobby, looking at the art, kind of entertaining myself for a while. And this guy comes and looked very harried, went up to the receptionist, super rude, kind of just a jerk. She was polite. She was super nice lady. The guy sat down kind of flustered. She rang up the person. He came down and they whispered back and forth a little bit. The gentleman, I didn't know who he was at the time, came over, said to him, hey, I'm going to save you some time. I'm really busy. Clear, you're really busy. And by the way you treated the receptionist, we're never going to work together anyway. So let's kill the meeting here. And he went back up. So fast forward a couple of years, I'd been working with this company for some time. That receptionist had been with the company for 25 years. In the org chart, she was no one. She was reception, the very bottom of the org chart. But in reality, she was personally friends with everyone in the executive suite. So when you talk about, this is a little bit of a tangent, admittedly, but when you talk about the unofficial org chart, it's amazing how different it can be from the real one.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said you were in sales at the time.
Yes.
So did you build a relationship with that receptionist then?
Oh, you bet
as
you
well?
did. Yeah, I could tell you stories for hours of times where the gatekeeper became my best friend and told me, you know what, Jerry, I'm not going to be here for 11:30. So if you call then, he'll pick up.
Yeah. It's interesting because I would reflect a little bit on my days in sales and how oftentimes salespeople, back to when I was an individual contributor, I remember being told this: sell high, start at the top, call above the level of, who you ultimately want to talk to, call the CEO. And I don't know, I tried that a few times, but I always found the best place to start was, first of all, you do have to be careful sometimes, particularly in big companies, because you can have people just waste all your time because they don't have anything to do. However, if you can find those people who are kind of and they're not always the top level people in the company by any stretch of the imagination, but the people who know everybody, who kind of, they're respected, people talk to them, they can both help set you up with the people you really need to talk to and advocate for you if you're nice to them and build a good relationship with them. And, and I think sincerity plays a big role too. It's not like you're losing those relationships, but, that can absolutely be mutually beneficial. And, I remember a couple of times specifically, it's like, why are you talking to that person? It's like, because they're kind of my Sherpa to the company. They're kind of telling me, who I need to build a relationship with and who I need to work with to get this certain thing done. And by the way, that goes beyond sales too.
Yes.
So absolutely.
I'll take it one step further. So I completely agree with you. So for those listening, Chris and I ran into this problem when we spoke the first time. We have nearly identical views. And so we get sidetracked easily in agreeing with each other. But I'll take that one step further, Chris, is I found, especially now that I've been a CEO a few times, when someone comes to me, a vendor from outside, I have an expectation that they understand my problem, that they're coming to me with a solution. I don't have to educate them on my internal workings. When you go top down, you don't have that benefit. But when you sell bottom up, you learn along the way not only what the real problems are inside the organization, whether or not you're a good match for solving them, but you can tailor your presentation to the pain points that CEO and his or her executive team are feeling and make a much more powerful presentation. So
Yeah.
I appreciate the perspective of top down, but I too would prefer to go bottom up where I can.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So
Good.
let me circle back to what you're talking about. Much more important, I think. So you said something that I agree with too, but I think that there's more than one view on. So I've unfortunately had to terminate many people in my career, but it's not something I ever do lightly, especially if I'm an interim CEO or I'm just taking the seat. So I agree with you. I don't want to let people go right away. I want to understand what's happening there first so that I'm not getting rid of people that ultimately A, are not a part of the problem, and B, could be a massive piece of the resolution of the problem. But I also am sensitive to the fact that as a person brought in to turn things around, very often the investors give you a small window. And I think that the reason why a lot of folks make those decisions quickly is because they're feeling that pressure of time. What do you think, Chris?
Oh, 100%. I mean, first of all, having walked into situations where, the company is losing money and on fire, oftentimes there's just necessity of, letting, unfortunately, cutting staff or, reduction in force. Just, it has to be done to sort of stabilize the business. I mean, I've been in situations like that, and they are no fun at all. And, I don't want to say too, because I think it's a little trite and offensive to say it's harder for, sometimes you feel like it's harder for the person doing it. Sometimes people, like, you can see the relief when you let them go, right? They kind of know they're not in a good place, and, it sort of frees them. But at the same time, nobody wants to lose their job. So I don't want to cheapen that. But yeah, sometimes it's a necessity, right? And that's hard. But even there, you have to be careful and be as diligent as you can. I mean, that puts even more urgency around understanding the culture and
100%.
understanding who truly is respected and who's kind of, getting things done. Um, there is and by the way, this was only published in the last month or two. Harvard Business Review actually I think it was HBR, did a recent interview with Tom Brady on leadership. And one of the things that really struck me about it, and I think it's still publicly available, because I think what HBR does sometimes is they make the articles publicly available for a period of time and then they put them behind the paywall. So I think folks can get it. I don't have the link or anything. But I remember he talked about identifying the teammates, and he was talking, I think, particularly about receivers who, some, like he was talking about Julian Edelman, for instance. By the way, I'm a Jet fan, so back to my New York. So it's not like I'm a Patriot nut, but I have a lot of respect for what the organization accomplished, and certainly what Tom Brady accomplished, right? And he was talking about, like, a guy like Julian Edelman, who absolutely is going to run through walls to do the best thing for the team. But then he also talked about the receivers that he had worked with, and he didn't name names in this case, who were more concerned about their stats and their trade value and kind of where they were ranking, and how their agent was perceiving the deal they were going to get next year. In other words, their priority was their career over the team, right? And not to say nobody should have a focus on their own career. I mean, career management is important to all of us, but that is one of the key tells, is finding the people who, in their level of priority, like the team, the business, and my own career, like, they're both important. I'm not saying people should just blindly, this often happens, particularly with younger people, they think, well, I should just go all in on the company and do whatever the company says I have to. No, you need to take care of yourself, but finding the people who are really working for the sake of the business, and they're looking to kind of maximize the outcome for the business, as opposed to those who are putting their career priorities higher, their personal priorities higher. And that one aspect, and Brady kind of talked about it in this interview, that's why I brought it up, it really struck me in terms of people he played with, that stands out. And if you can find those people in particular, who really are, their goal is to, it's on the team, it's on the business. Those are the ones you really want to try to keep, if at all possible, and work with.
I agree.
So even if what they're doing is misaligned at the moment, you can take that motivation and point it in the right direction.
I agree,
So
but I think so. Circling back to the cultural piece, I I think at least I've seen some of what you're describing as a manifestation of the company's culture. Because in my experience, the more that people feel like their leadership cares about their outcome as well, the more those people
mhm.
care about the leadership and the organization. But if that leader you came in and replaced was toxic and made it clear that everyone there was a number with a value stamp on their forehead,
Mhm.
unsurprisingly, those people don't put a lot of stake in the outcome of the organization.
100% it's a two-way street.
Yeah.
Absolutely positively. You can't expect people to behave as team players if they don't think the team's watching out for them. Then that is absolutely going to push people more to, care about their personal motivation. And I think this is a lot of the reason that, companies struggle is because leadership's not setting that framework. But again, I'm taking that as a given because I know what I prioritize when I go into these situations. Nonetheless, it's something that I've seen multiple times. It's just, I mean, the two-word answer is team player.
Yes.
Are they team players? Is that their priority? That we win the game as opposed to, maximizing the career, thinking about my contract, and like I said, I think Brady put it really well in this piece. It doesn't mean they're bad players. It doesn't mean they're bad people, but their primary motivation is not the team winning as a team. It's their own careers. And so,
Yeah.
let's just say he was a little less complimentary to those types of folks. He had a much stronger preference for the Julian Edelman type receivers. I know he called out Edelman multiple times as that type of team player that he wanted to play with. So,
I couldn't agree more. And I'll say too, back from my staffing days, one of the things I learned early on, and it's been a guidepost to me throughout the entirety of my career, is that there are far more bad matches than there are bad people and bad companies. If that
mhm.
person isn't aligned with that company's goals and values and really tenets, then it's never going to be fruitful. Period. Full stop. It doesn't make them bad. Doesn't make the company mad. It just makes them a bad match. And I'll take that one step further. We're seeing it a lot now. This might be too meta for a conversation like this, but there's such an erosion of trust in anything with authority in today's society that it's difficult as a leader, especially when you're dealing with a younger team, to get
Mhm.
any real buy-in for the organization because their perception is that organization equals bad. If you spend, and I know you and I both do, any amount of time on LinkedIn, virtually any comment about a company or a business is highlighting the negatives. And that
Mhm.
makes, in my opinion, what we're describing now much more difficult because people are coming from a zero trust mindset, especially younger folks.
Yeah, it's sad but true. And I think the kind of just media environment that we're in, and I don't know, I think the media political environment, they change over time. I think just what people kind of see and hear, whether watching movies, reading books, tends to think, institutions are bad. And by the way, I say not just companies, but institutions,
100% yes.
because, it can be public institutions and not, I spent actually 4.5 years running a company that sold primarily, we were for profit, but we sold primarily to the nonprofit world, got to know how nonprofits are structured, which is, similar but different to corporations. But, organizations, yeah, people, like I said, a little bit of, I got to protect myself is good because I do think that sometimes, particularly, look, my kids are all in their 20s, actually, one just crossed into her 30s, and I say this all the time that, to them and to my students, like, protect yourself. You have to, because, particularly when you're earlier in your career, you can be taken advantage of if you're not careful.
Yes.
At the same time, the goal is for the team to win. So, and that's what you need to be focused on. And if what you're doing is spending your time all day managing your career to not necessarily maybe the detriment of the team, but like, you're not spending time focused on the team, it's going to be harder. And so when, somebody comes in and says, okay, we have to sort of figure out who are the real team players here, who's carrying the ball, management needs to make those decisions. So, but yeah, it's all a two-way street.
Yeah, I say this not to say that the problem we're describing is unsolvable or to disagree with your position about about coming in with a certain awareness. I say to highlight the need for communication,
Mm-hmm.
because
Right.
you and I seem to be cut from a very, very similar cloth. When I come into a new organization, I'm looking to do right by that organization and grow it. And that
Mm-hmm.
organization is comprised of the people that are in it. I know that in my heart, I know that in my head, but if I don't take the time to say that and articulate it clearly, I've found that the assumptions that especially younger folks are making are negative, and it just makes things more difficult. We're butting heads more than is necessary or fruitful.
Right. Right. And this is an area where certainly, particularly in this sort of venture funded world, equity and also in the private equity world, equity is often used as a motivator and incentive, to align interests, because it's a tool that can help align interests over the long term. It can also be abused, but it can be effective done properly. The other thing, though, I'd say too is I I say this all the time, and I'd be interested in hearing. I don't think I mentioned this to you last time we talked either. I am a big believer too that sometimes you also have to recognize that some people just want to come in, get their work done, get a paycheck, and go home.
Yes,
And I actually think there's more of that in younger generations these days, which is interesting. They're they're not really, they're working to live. They're not living to work, and that's okay, by the way. There's nothing wrong with
100%.
that. I mean, people who have that motivation can play very valuable roles in a company. You just have to recognize it. At the same time, they sometimes have to recognize, and this is where I think there's sometimes friction, that also means that, okay, but you might not be the first one who's going to be considered for the promotion or the bigger role or the bigger title or the bigger salary. But, yeah, we'll plug you in a role and do your job, and it's a valuable job. And you want to come in at 9 and go home at 5 and not get email aside from that and not think about work outside. No problem. No problem. Like, and a lot of people think that way. And I think in the startup world in particular, we tend to think, and I think it is somewhat true. First of all, people who come work for startups, at least people who should be going to startups, that they are thinking long term, the best interests of the company, right? They're kind of, the balance, the separation between their work life and their personal life is less, and that's not a judgment on where it should be. For everybody, it's different, but recognize that there's people, they're just there for a paycheck, and that doesn't make them bad. So,
100%.
but you have to recognize that trying to give them stock options is probably going to be unsuccessful, or much less successful than it would be with somebody else, because that's not what they're there for.
Yep. And
So,
frankly, I would argue they don't belong there because there's a misalignment of values. They belong in a big, stable Fortune 500 company where them coming and going in 2 or 3 years impacts negatively no one. So I,
yeah.
I love that you're not assigning blame or saying it's a good or a bad thing, because I completely agree. I think you and I both have a little bit of gray in our beard and our hair, and we remember a time our parents, our grandparents, they had 1 or 2 jobs in their life. They worked for a company,
Mm-hmm.
and that was it. Then in our generation, it became 3 to 5. And then in the next generation, the millennials, it became 7 to 10. And with Gen Z folks, they're looking at 2 year hitches. They're developing almost
Yeah.
a project mentality instead of a job mentality.
Well, first of all, back at you. How many big, stable Fortune 500 companies are there these days, particularly
Fair
stable?
call out.
That's one. I mean, the world is much more dynamic. It's much more, and I think this is also where globalism has come in, right? It's much more globally competitive
Yes.
these days. But, also, as you said, more people are wanting to do kind of gig work these days. I actually just reconnected last week with a former colleague who I worked with for 5, 6 years, who I hadn't seen in many years, partly because she and her husband live in Europe, and she's over here for leaf peeping season in Boston. She grew up in the Boston area, but she called. She's like, "Let's get together. I'd love to see you. It's been so many years." And she was basically telling me, and by the way, she works with a very big Fortune 500 and probably one of the more stable companies, but her preference is to be a contract worker.
Yep.
And that's what she likes doing. And she's got particular industry expertise, and she's been doing it very successfully for years. And that's the way she wants to work. And, and to some degree, that's sort of I wouldn't say it's the value prop for everybody at TechSafe, but that's kind of back to me, right? You're doing more contract short term. You can do it later in your career. It's not just an early career thing. You just
100%.
have to be
Yes.
conscious about it. And, the pros and cons, because it's a different model. So
It's interesting because I started off a perm employee, and then when I started my entrepreneurship, it was really solopreneur. And gosh, I mean, an interim role is by definition a contract. You're there for a prescribed
mhm.
period of time until a certain issue is resolved. So
Right.
it's just a different mindset. But circling back to culture, everything we've talked about in this, for me at least, is highlighting how critically important, and this is consulting 101, I might add, clear communication, setting expectation, and then managing throughout that expectation. Because when I'm
Hmm.
interviewing a new person for my company, I need to uncover and understand what they're trying to achieve with that engagement. Are they looking for a career? Are they looking for 5 to 7 years? Are they looking to resolve this one issue that we're working on and then they get bored? And I know myself,
Hmm.
my sweet spot for companies are sub 1,000 employees. When they get
Hmm.
past, like at Apicero, when we were acquired, we were 2,500 folks, 9 offices, 3 countries. The last year or so for me was not great. It wasn't the type of org I fell in love with. I was second
Hmm.
hired employee straight through, and once we got past 1,000, it just too much like a real job for me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The other thing that I wanted to pick up on, and something you said, and back to kind of when I was talking about the Tom Brady analogy and people, the only other thing I would also say, and I think it's part and parcel with your example of, people like that maybe belong in bigger companies. I do think the managing the career, it's a natural thing. Tendency is much more prevalent in bigger companies. I know when I was with a company called Vertica Systems that was acquired by HP, and it was kind of right as we were kind of going through the getting acquired, and HP had a lot of issues when they bought Vertica. So, and Vertica was doing really well when they acquired it. So it was actually a good. HP has a kind of reputation as being a bad acquirer, but I think Vertica was a very good acquisition for them. But partly for that reason, they left us alone for a while. So even though we were sort of owned by them, we were kind of free to do what we wanted to for a while, and it was overall a great experience. It was kind of the best of both worlds. But as we got more and more integrated into the parent company over the 5 years I was there, you could definitely see a tendency, and I felt myself getting sucked into it too. To you were spending less and less time on the external battles in the market and more time on the climbing the ladder, working the org, managing my career, even inside the company stuff. And it's very hard, and that becomes very pervasive in these bigger companies as well. And to some degree, when I finally left after 5 years, and again, it was a wonderful 5 years, it really was. But maybe the last year wasn't quite as wonderful as the prior four, but it was good. But and by the way, very sophisticated HR, like beyond my wildest imagination. Like they had a great HR team that, from a training, that's where I got my media training and all, just kind of general. Well, I guess media training was more of a marketing thing, but there was a lot of good stuff that came out of the HR function there. Really, really super impressive, much more than I ever expected to. Because when you live in the startup world, you're kind of like, HR basically is like making sure payroll's right.
Yeah,
It's like
exactly.
that my insurance coverage is correct, and I get different docs signed off, but you don't realize all the other value they can provide. But anyway, but yeah, you find yourself getting sucked into that. Like, you're more focused on your career than you are focused on, like, hey, what's going on in the business and who we're competing with and winning customers and growing business. And so anyway, and so I think in bigger companies in particular, that leadership and keeping people focused on, I mean, that's a talent that the big company CEOs, really have to have. Halligan, because HubSpot's pretty big, he's not the CEO anymore, but I think he's the chairman, but he talks about that a lot. Like, he just basically spent all of his time doing presentations, and obviously presentations to investors, presentations to customers and prospects, but just presentations to the team, to just try to keep the team focused on, like, what's the mission, because it's so easy to get distracted with this other stuff. So
And I think so. Circling back to culture, I think all the things that we're talking about here, the critical thing is understanding what the culture is, whether it's a startup that you founded and you were there from day one, whether you're an interim person in a 10-year-old org, doesn't matter. Understanding what the culture is and then weighing what that culture is against what it needs to be for you to achieve what you want to do. And then
mhm.
figuring out the gap. I gave you a copy of my book when we met the first time. I hope you get a chance to read it at some point. But we talk a lot about, I have a very simple leadership framework. I call it the EFG leadership framework: engage, fulfill, and grow. And it's simple by design because it's meant to work in a lot of areas. But the engagement that we start with is how you learn about what culture you're inheriting. And then you can compare that against what you know it needs to be, and then, create the changes necessary. So when you step into an interim role, Chris, what tools do you use, or how do you assess the existing culture so you can do that?
I think the biggest one is just management by walking around,
Oh, I love that.
getting to know people, spending time with people. It's harder in this now sort of semi-virtual day that we live in because people don't want to get out of their bedrooms and their kitchens or their home offices. It's harder to do on Zoom. It's still doable. It actually is an enabler too, though. You don't necessarily need to spend as much time on airplanes, but you still need to figure out how to blend kind of the in-person, because I think you just get so many more cues from people when you meet with them live than when you're on some kind of web conference tool with them. But it's really just kind of, getting to know the people, and then, figuring out how they're aligned with the strategy. I will say one thing that, management leadership, they do need to set the strategy.
Yes.
You can't really do. Corporate strategy. And I think this was like Halligan was alluding to. It can't be set by committee. You just can't do that. And that's sometimes where things can get challenging, and sometimes people can get a little upset, because there's a big difference between making sure everybody is heard, and that doesn't mean you get a vote.
Yes.
And I've actually said that so many times in team meetings that, like, yes, we're going this way, right? And usually, like, something that gets to the CEO of the company is a decision where it is not at all clear cut that this way is the right way. There's very good arguments to go that way. And there's going to be people in the company who feel like we should go that way. And whether it's better for them or whether they think it's better for the business, and you're saying, no, we're going this way. Now, you want to hear why they think that way is the right way to go. And you don't want to shut those voices out, and nor do you want them to feel run over. But at the end of the day, we're going this way. And that's what you got to get lined up behind. And, those are the hardest things, right? Because oftentimes I say, the CEO's job is fundamentally, to be the tiebreaker for those kind of decisions, and then give clarity about which direction we're going. And, that's, in a lot of ways, I don't know if it's the most important job, but it's certainly one of the most important. It's setting the direction, right? And making sure everybody's clear on the direction. So you're going to be heard. We're not just going to run over you. We're not going to ignore, and then you get the personalities who do the passive aggressive disagreement.
Yes.
That's the toxic
They're the worst
people. By the way, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was agreeing with you. They're the worst. I'll catapult on just because I'm talking real quick. But one of the things I learned in the Marines is you can delegate everything but responsibility and leadership. And as a CEO, everything stops with you. And one of the things you said that I like, and I talk again, that's what the engagement piece is. I want to hear what everybody thinks, and I value your input. But once the decision's made, we're all rowing in this direction. And if you're not, you don't have a place here anymore.
Yeah, and the subtle underminers.
Yes, they are the worst.
When I talk about needing to find people, you need to find them too. And they're harder to find, and it takes a longer amount of time. But those are the people who, it's an unpleasant analogy, but unfortunately, and they may not, look, it doesn't necessarily make them bad human beings. They may be fully well-intended. They may be wonderful people in their personal lives. In some cases they are. But they're killing the organization.
They're the cancers.
It's basically cancer in the organization.
100%
right?
agree.
You need to find the people who are not willing to get on board with the direction, and the ones who unfortunately tend to be best at it are the ones who do it in a very subtle, passive aggressive way. That is, the reason that you also need to walk around, because that's the only way you're going to pick up these subtle cues that something was said in a meeting by somebody that is undermining the direction that you're taking the company in. And, you hear that once, fine. You hear it twice. You start to hear that multiple times, and you start to hear some of the same names getting attached to that commentary. those are the people that unfortunately you need to, generally speaking, sit down and have a serious talk with.
Agree
And if they're
completely.
artful, which oftentimes they are, even that talk may not yield the best discussion. But ultimately, like, you need to, those situations can't continue. So one way or another, they need to end. So people need to get on board with the direction. That's where the clarity of communication also is super important.
100%.
So,
And you're right. The hardest thing about the passive aggressive folks, it's sometimes not even what they're saying, but how they're saying it. You know, I can say, "Hey, Chris, nice shirt." And you can hear that I like your shirt. I can say, "Hey, Chris, nice shirt." And you can hear that I don't like your shirt. Same words, but it's how the message was given that matters. And I avoided the HR tangent you offered me, and I'm going to avoid the remote tangent you're offering me as well. But I am going to say that remote work does make maintaining a cohesive culture more difficult, and it requires
absolutely.
even more engagement and outreach.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It does, because you still can maintain the formal connections through, we're setting up a Zoom or whatever your conferencing tool of choice is, but the informal bumping into people in the hall stuff, it's much, I wouldn't say it doesn't happen, but it's much harder to facilitate that.
Exactly, because
So,
it's
yeah.
never going to be an organic, accidental meeting. If we're talking, it's
Mm-hmm.
planned. And that
Right.
that for sure lose something. We used to talk about it when remote first started coming up, before COVID, when it still wasn't the norm. You know, if you're a
Mm-hmm.
remote employee, you miss the before meeting and after meeting meetings. You miss the opportunities for those just organic bumps in the hallway you just described, and that's a real
Mm-hmm.
thing. I I am not a remote purist, nor am I an in-office purist. I think
Mm-hmm.
it varies based on roles, based on experience, based on use cases. But it definitely, in
Yep.
my experience, is more difficult to train and to create culture when it's remote.
Yep. It's interesting this week, or maybe it was last week. I think the announcement was made last week, or maybe even a little before that. I'm not sure if you caught that Amazon announced they're going from 3 days in the office to 5 days in the
Yes,
office. And I have a number of friends at Amazon, most of whom are more senior folks who are, that's the other thing you find. A lot of times more senior people are they're pretty comfortable being remotely productive, because, they're just at the point in their careers if they need to talk to somebody. It's sometimes the earlier career people who need
completely agree.
sort of in the office more. But anyway, Amazon announced everybody has to come in. And I actually brought this up yesterday, as a matter of fact, with my Northeastern class, who are sophomores and juniors, so they're undergrads. Although Northeastern has a co-op program, so most of them have work experience, not just like summer jobs before college. They've been inside of companies. And I sort of showed part of Andy Jassy, the new CEO of Amazon. He framed it in a way that this is going to be better for culture and our innovation. And that's, the course is actually disruption culture. We were talking about the impact of culture on disruption and innovation. Anyway, to make a long story short, I asked the kids, like, what do you think of this? Do you think that coming back to the office is going to be more positive, more negative? I was surprised, and I think pleasantly surprised, that they shaded it slightly more positive.
Nice.
I was almost thinking that, I know I had a team of 20 somethings coming through the pandemic, and post the pandemic, when we could start going back into the office, those the gray haired team at the company was excited to, like, be able to come back and start talking to people. And I had a bunch of 22-year-olds who were like, nah, I'm good in my bedroom. And it was like, no, you don't need to be here 40 hours a week, but you should come in once in a while. And there was a couple who, like, really didn't want to do it. And I was like, it's not just for the company. You're actually missing something for yourself if you're not kind of getting in to interact with people. But anyway, there was a desire among my students to, like, they sort of recognize it, right? Like, I'm not saying, we'll never have a pandemic again, but it's kind of like that's a little bit in the rearview mirror now. And they saw the value of, like, being in there. Nobody likes to commute. Being mandated 40 hours a week in the office, maybe that's a little much, but generally speaking, bumping into people in the hallway is a good thing.
Can
I think
you
that was what I took away.
imagine you would come to a place in your life where you said the words you just did? Maybe being expected to be in the office 40 hours a week is a bit much. I mean,
Yeah, I know.
that's it's so crazy. I'm not saying you're wrong at all, but you know what's interesting? What you just said about Amazon, and this may be the way it was portrayed by the media to get more clicks and more attention, but it was
Mhm.
very much a forced thing. We will be in the office 5 days a week. immediately Microsoft put out a note saying, we are not requiring that. I could almost smell the director of talent acquisition at Microsoft rubbing his hands together going to grab all the people that Amazon was going to shed.
Yeah, although whether that's going to work or not, we'll
For
see.
sure.
But yeah, look, and the big companies, particularly the big tech companies, massively overhired in
Blitz
the
scaling.
21,
Yes.
22, even late 20s, zero interest rate, ZERP, as we say. They massively overhired, and they're still working that off.
1,000%.
So they're not looking to suck up more people at this point. I mean, let's call it what it is, right? It's to some degree, this is if some people decide they don't like this and they leave, that's okay. So because they are massively overstaffed. So I doubt Microsoft is looking to add. Certainly there might be selectively some, people they'd want to add, but
Yeah.
I have a feeling those people at Amazon are the ones who may have gotten exemptions from some of those rules, right? Because they recognize that they're special contributors.
My oldest son is a leader in the Amazon robotics department. He works in their optics department. He designs the optic systems for their factory robots, and he received exactly zero pressure for a 40-hour-a-week return to office. But to your point, it's interesting. So I don't want to jump on the ZERP blitz scaling. Those are two things I hate more than anything. And of all the crazy ideas that came out, blitz scaling is their king. We look back at all these images of tech companies with people gathered around ping pong tables and foosball tables, and now we understand it's because they had 5 people for every 2 that they needed. But yeah, circling back to the realities of the marketplace, the big companies will always be hunting each other's top talent. That's never what's going on in the macro economy is nearly irrelevant. Their top talent will always have a bullseye on their back for the other folks. But a lot of these initiatives, just like when a big company moves headquarters from one city to another, there's always almost always significant tax reasons why to do so. They get basically gifted a lot of free tax or tax breaks to move there. But also the more subtle thing is they get rid of a lot of those 20-year low-level employees that they can replace. And this is harsh to say, but for far less in the new city and get nearly the same output. Mm-hmm. But circling back to what we're talking about with culture, I'm sorry, I don't mean to steal the mic. You said something important that I don't want lost, especially since you're also a professor. The return to office, as much as it's unpleasant in a lot of ways, really is beneficial to the more junior folks, because a lot of the real world learning they get is through osmosis and observation of other people. Graybeards like you and I'm not saying we don't still learn, but we've gotten a lot of that already. We can sit on an island and not be hurt. But that 20-year-old just jumping in, there's so much value in seeing how things are done in the real world versus how they were taught.
Right. Absolutely.
Especially salespeople. Oh my gosh. I'll tell you this right now. As someone who has trained, I was a sales trainer for a very long time. What I could teach them and show them versus them watching top performers do it, night and day difference.
Mm-hmm. Sales is a culture. I was tempted to go down the sales route when we were talking earlier about kind of motivations and team players and, versus max. Yeah. I can tell you, I guess I'll just briefly say some of the most successful, at least in terms of, closing deals and maximizing revenue for the company, but maximizing their own commissions. People that I've worked with over the years, not all, by the way, so hopefully nobody hears this and get offended, but I can definitely think of multiple cases. They were the worst people at playing in the sandbox and in terms of just behaviors that really were not healthy for the business. And, there can be a real mercenary. And it's hard to say this, but you want a bit of that sometimes in sales, but that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
Right. So sales is kind of a special case.
It really is. I think you and I touched on it when we spoke before, and I'll be gleeful to have you back to deep dive this, but I'm going to say something that, and I don't mean this to be hurtful in any way, sales systems and policies are made for the middle of the pack and to pull the bottom into the middle. If you're a top
Well,
producer in
we
my
can,
org, I'll let you play how you want to play as long as you don't poison my well. If you poison my well, you're
right.
out.
Well, we can close on. I still remember a CEO I worked for a few years ago, not too many years ago. He asked me to interview a potential head of sales. I was a senior sales rep. I think it was more of a senior sales rep. I don't think it was a VP of sales candidate. And during the interview, the sales candidate asked me about equity and stock options. And when I was reporting that back to the CEO basically said they're out. And I'm like, what do you mean? He said, I don't want sales thinking about stock options. I want them thinking about commission, 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 this quarter, this quarter, this quarter, right or wrong. And by the way, he was a very much a sales driven CEO too. The world of sales is just different. It's
Yes.
just much more short term. And I don't know. That seemed a little extreme to me. I think it maybe still does these days. And also, the question, which I have to go mentally rewind to whether they're coming in as more of a sales leader, or more senior salesperson. But they wanted short termism in that role. But that's something that makes it very different than other roles. So
I am not Joe Rogan, so this won't become a 3-hour show. I'm going to pick this as an endpoint, and I'm going to be honest, it feels random because I want to talk for another 2 hours. So I would love to have you back on, Chris. I will gladly have you back on every time we can have a good, meaningful talk. But in the interim, where can folks find you?
well, at techcxo.com,
Mm-hmm.
techcxo.com, and it's easy to find our people and look me up there. That's, my day job. And that's, and working with my clients, and also, of course, on LinkedIn. I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. I actually met, it's funny you mentioned blitzscaling. I met Reid Hoffman very, very early. I was actually one of the first people, as I was told, outside of Silicon Valley who was on LinkedIn. I think it was back in like 2005. So I'm a big LinkedIn user
Same.
advocate. I'm very easy to find there. I think LinkedIn is a great platform. So find me there, or find me at TechCXO.
Awesome. Well, so folks who are longtime listeners, those two locations will be in the show notes, and you don't have to hunt for him on TechCXO. I'm going to link his actual profile page, which I believe also links to his LinkedIn page as well, but
I'm
both
sure.
will be in show notes.
Yes.
And for new listeners, now you don't have to crash your car on the Mass Pike. Just when you get where you're going, click the show notes, you'll be able to find that stuff. Chris, I want to talk more. I can't force you. I'm going to come as close as I can. But between now and then, I thank you very much for being on the show once more, Chris.
It's been a pleasure as always.
Awesome.
So let's do it again, Jerry.
Awesome. That sounds great. Folks, between now and next week, continue running great businesses and make amazing things. Thanks very much.